Here's a pretty off-white bridesmaid dress, and the sides need taking in. I'm going to show you how to either take in or let out the sides on a bodice. This particular dress is the easiest type to take in. I'll show you why. First, though, we take a look at the bottom hem, and typically there's going to be a sheer overlay of chiffon, or maybe it's taffeta or satin, and then has two underskirts. So, if you can place your hand in between the two underskirts and roll it back and put your hand in between all the way up to the waist, you'll encounter your first little obstacle, which is simply to cut this connection of threads. Once those threads are cut, keep going all the way up to the armpit. See? If you can do that, if you can make your way all the way up to the armpit, because essentially the linings are just dresses inside of the dress, then this is the easiest type of bridesmaid dress or formal wear dress to alter. Now, while you're in there at the armpit, is a good time to assess how much seam allowance there is, especially if you're going to be letting out. Here's the lining part, here's the dress part. Actually, I've got that backwards. This is the lining part, this is the dress. The dress, not a lot of seam allowance. So I think we would be in trouble for letting out very much if she needed that. Fortunately, she wants to be taken in. Now, on the lining, we can't tell how much seam allowance there is right now because there's boning in here. So we're going to have to deal with that too. Fortunately for this dress, here's the armpit still, and here are the two waists. All we have to do is take it in about 4 inches down and stop short of the waist, which is kind of lucky if we don't have to go through the waist. But sometimes we do, and I'll talk about that some too. Having assessed that seam allowance situation, go back out to the front of the dress. Pick a side seam, any side seam, and let's get started. We get started by looking at the inside of that underarm. Here's one of those hang ribbons for the hanger. Here's the boning that we can feel through here. And right here is some stitching, some understitching. We want to rip out a certain amount of that, about 2 inches on each side, or maybe even more, so that there's room for us to get in there. For now, just take your seam ripper and let's pick that out. I now want to release the two layers, the front from the back. So because I'm rather adept, I go in through the top. You don't have to. You can opt to go from the underside and rip out this seam, this underarm seam, between the 2 points that you just picked out the understitching. Okay? Just go slow and easy. Just take her easy. Until it's free. And allow yourself enough room. At first blush, you might think, well, why am I going so far on either side of the seam? Believe me, once you get in there, the tight quarters, you'll be glad you have enough room to maneuver. Because we are going to be taking this in 2 inches total. That means a whole inch on either side, and then you got to have a little bit of leeway, room to move. Okay, Now when you kind of separate this back, you'll see there's another obstacle of a few threads, just like there kind of was at the waist, to get through. So just nick them out. Turn it all inside out again. Like so. At this point on the lining, we have to get rid of this boning, at least for now. And I'm happy to see that it's kind of one of the more difficult to remove boning pieces. So I'll show you how that's done. We have to do it in order to access the seam, which the boning is right on top of. Once the casing for the boning is somewhat free here, you can usually just pull the boning right out. Sometimes it's attached at the top. You'll find many and varied ways that boning is attached. Sometimes it's just a piece that isn't even covered up with a casing. I prefer that. But anyway, once we get the boning out, now it'll be easier to take off the casing. So keep ripping and get that off. Okay, so while this is still, in my humble opinion, the easiest kind of formal wear dress bodice to do, that boning casing was a little bit of a stinker. So here's what it looks like now with the boning out and all detached, except down at the waist. It's still on there here. I'm just going to snip it off rather than struggle with picking out the stitches here. Why? Because I think they sewed it in with the waist seam, and I don't want to undo that if I don't have to. Especially since I'm only going to be taking this in 4 inches down and not all the way. And now here's something else I'm going to share with you. I'm never going to put that stay back in. Here's why. There's plenty of stays everywhere else. In the back, in the front, under the bra. I have never had a situation where a person needed that much support with the stays that they had to have them back in. So unless your customer, is savvy enough to request to have it in, don't put them back unless, again, preference. It's all up to you unless you want to. I'm not going to be showing you how to do that though. That's going to be very difficult to do in this tight area space. Once I get this seam taken in, really, how am I going to get that boning back in there without a lot of free arm work, if you can even do it? All right, so nobody needs it, not really. Let it go. And by the way, sometimes you find that the boning has been put on the front part of the dress. Okay, I like it better actually when they do put it on the lining. It's easier to get off and less likely to wreak havoc with anything with the front. Anyway, we've got it off. Let's look at the lining seam now. Here's a little bit of the ribbon showing through from the hang ribbon, all right? And we see there's not a lot of seam allowance here at all. This would not be an instance where I would be able to let this dress out at all, dictated by the seam allowance on the lining being less than actually on the dress, okay? Alrighty, we figured out a lot up to this point. We figured out this is not a dress to let out if that's what we were doing. We got everything detached at the armpit and that boning off. From here, we're going to figure out a pin line for both the lining and the dress for taking in and get this baby taken in. Let's start at the lining side. Here's the armpit. We're going to stop here at 4 inches down. So I'm going to place a pin right there. You want to measure whatever your situation is. I happen to be able to eyeball inches. Now, let me just free this up a little bit. Up here at the armpit is where the most needs to be taken in. 2 inches total. I can see where an inch is. I'm going to stick the pin in there, and between the two seams, we will have 2 inches off. Now I'm going to connect these 2 dots, like so, and that's what I'm going to be doing. Sewing right along here. By the way, we determined at the fitting that everything fits really great for her right from here on down to the waist, and that's why we're just taking the 4 inches in down, because it's right out here is where it's just too gappy for her at the underarm. Okay? Now, if you were going to be taking this in further down, here's how you would do it. You would go further down and you make your pin line extend down to the waist or beyond if necessary. This dress is a little bit ornery in that it's not the continuous seam that usually the lining is. It just is connected lengthwise and not widthwise. In this instance, I'd have to take out the waist a little ways so that this would be free, and keep running through here, then starting at the skirt, take in through here. Once they were taken in and trimmed, I would put them back together again at the waist. That's what you would do. One more detail that I almost forgot. You want to make sure that this ribbon is accounted for and is not all messed up in here. So I'm going to try and feel for it. I can't really feel for it. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take out my nice pin job and just make sure. No, see, it was sticking out here because I pulled it out for you guys before. Make sure it's in there nice and straight. Shake it in there straight. Feel for it. Make sure it's laying under there nice and straight. If you have to stick a pin in there to place hold it for now, as much as 1 inch, do so, and then go back. I'll go back now to pinning, and I'll double check this again in a minute just to make sure. But this way you have control of that ribbon in between the layers. And now we are ready to run this along the seam allowance guide on the machine and just taper out a pie-shaped wedge. Okay? So you guys know how to sew. I'm not going to actually show you the sewing machine part. I'm just going to come back after each step and show you how the sewing, how the stitches of integrity turned out. One more thing. This is a usual occurrence where your sides are just not going to match up anymore. When you take in a slant like this, mathematically, it's not going to match up down here. Do not struggle with making that match, meaning this pulled up to this point. Just let it lie naturally. You can feel along and make sure it is laying back here naturally. Here's what would happen if you didn't, and if you felt like you had to. You'd pull this up, try and make it match, and now you got bulk in here. See, that's no good. Just let it lie naturally. I'll show you how we take care of that later. It's no big thing. Okay? Okay, look how nicely that pie wedge worked out on the lining. All we got to do now is the same thing on the dress side of things. So I'm going to turn it around. And make a pin line. Notice how this time this mismatch part is facing you. I don't have to contend with anything extra underneath, like the ribbon. And I'll run this line. Okay, 2 wedges, and when we snap the seams together here, they match up, and that's what we want. Ideally, you want to stop here until your subject comes for her fitting, just to make sure everything's right. But we're going to barrel ahead as though everything is just perfectly fine. here are the next steps. Trim your wedges. But leave it kind of generous, just in case. Rip out this old slant seam. You want to rip out the old stitching on either side from where you trimmed, because these are going to open up flat as they match together at the armpit. Now for putting this armpit back together. With the lining side facing, spread those seams and stick your first pin through the very center of those seams, right on the seam line, front and back. What looks to be about a 3/8 inch seam allowance in. So there, you nailed it in the center. I'm just going to fold this extra piece back for now. Don't let that distract you. Now we just have 2 little gap areas left to close the distance on. So still keeping those seams spread. Just jab a pin in there. Don't worry about those seams and how it looks. Now get over to this other little remaining gap. Which ends right about here. I actually don't need this little piece here, so I'm just going to cut it off. This stuff is all extraneous. You don't need it. And it's going to seem like you're running blind here, but I'm going to run from where you can see the seam that isn't ripped, right on through here, through the midpoint, on through past the end of the green pin here, right where you see this little ridge of ditch here, a little bit beyond, and stop. From here to here. From here to here is where we just stitched. And you can see how we started out just a little past the gap here at that ridge point and ended at that ridge point I mentioned earlier. And in between, we went a little deep and curved. Let's turn it right side out and see what we've got. And there it is. It looks perfect from the outside. You can see this is where we just stitched through this whole area right here. The ribbon hangs off nicely. We're just fine without the boning, and it looks great from the front. This is the other side that we haven't done yet. When you compare the two, not much difference. It's a steeper curve through here now, but it's going to fit her great and more snugly, which is what she needs because it was gapping way out. So the only thing to do now is tackle the other side. And now this beautiful bridesmaid dress bodice is finished. I just want to encourage you to tackle this kind of job for yourself, for your friends, for your family, and even in your business. This is a high demand alteration. People really need this kind of service. So don't hold back. All you really had to do was take apart the armpit, get the boning out, if there even is any, get the seams taken in or let out, put it back together up here at the armpit, and you're finished. Practice will make perfect. Folks, this is what superhero sewing is all about. Good job.